I'm writing this from a small apartment in Portland, and honestly, I still can't believe I'm here. 6 months ago, I was living in my dream home, a small wooden cabin I'd spent years saving for, tucked deep in the forests of northern Washington. I left it all behind. The mortgage I'd finally managed to pay off, the garden I'd spent 2 summers building, the life I thought I'd have forever. I had to give it all up because something out there wouldn't let me go. Everyone keeps asking why I moved so suddenly. My family thinks I had some kind of breakdown. My old coworkers probably think I lost my mind, and maybe they're right, but I know what I saw. I know what happened during those 4 weeks, and I know why I'll never go back to that house, no matter how much money it costs me. This isn't easy to talk about. For months, I didn't tell anyone the real reason I left. I said I wanted to be closer to the city, that I missed people, that the isolation was getting to me. Technically, all of that was true. But the real reason I packed a single bag, got in my truck at 3 in the morning, and drove 6 hours straight without stopping is because something was stalking my house every single night for a month. And it wasn't an animal. At least, not any kind of animal that's supposed to exist. Let me start from the beginning, because even now, the whole thing still feels surreal. I bought the cabin about 14 months before I had to leave. It was everything I'd ever wanted. 2 bedrooms, a wood-burning stove, a wraparound porch, and 40 acres of pine forest bordering national land. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles down a dirt road. The closest town was a 20-minute drive on a good day, longer when it snowed. I've always liked being alone. It's not that I'm antisocial, I just recharge better when I have space and quiet. City life drains me, too crowded, too loud, too much concrete. So when I saw the listing online for a price lower than I expected, I jumped on it. The previous owners were an older couple who'd moved to Arizona for health reasons. They seemed eager to sell, almost relieved to be rid of it. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first year was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. I'd wake up to nothing but birdsong and the sound of wind moving through the trees. I'd drink coffee on the porch and watch deer wander through the clearing. Weekends were spent hiking the trails on my land, learning about plants, exploring the terrain. I planted vegetables, fixed up the shed, replaced a few rotted boards on the porch. It was the peaceful, simple life I'd always wanted. I worked remotely, so the isolation wasn't a problem. Once a week, I'd drive into town for groceries and supplies, chat with a few locals, then head back to my quiet sanctuary. I became friends with a forest ranger who patrolled the nearby national land. Every few weeks, he'd stop by to check in, make sure I was doing okay out there by myself. Good guy. We'd have coffee and talk about wildlife sightings, the weather, that kind of thing. Thinking back now, I can't help but wonder if he knew something. Maybe he'd heard stories about the area, but he never said a word. Not until it was too late. Everything started in late September, a little over a year after I moved in. The air had just begun to turn cold, and I was getting the cabin ready for winter. I spent the whole day splitting firewood and stacking it under a tarp beside the house. I was exhausted but content, ready for a hot shower and an early night. I remember cooking dinner, just some pasta with vegetables from the garden, and eating it on the porch like I usually did. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful, peaceful. I remember thinking how lucky I was, how glad I was that I'd taken the risk to move out here. After dinner, I went inside, washed the dishes, and stretched out on the couch with a book, my usual routine. I'd read until about 10, and then head to bed. Simple, comfortable, safe. Around 9:30, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling. That happens sometimes, old wood breaking and dropping to the ground. But then came a heavy sound, like something big, stepping onto the porch. I froze and listened. The cabin was completely silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Another thump, definitely on the porch, definitely footsteps. My first thought was a bear. There are black bears in that area. They wander close sometimes, looking for food. I'd always been careful not to leave anything outside that might attract them, but maybe something had caught a scent. I slowly stood and walked toward the window. The porch light was on, casting a pale yellow glow across the wooden boards. I pulled the curtain open just a few inches and looked out. Nothing. The porch was empty, but I could still hear it. A dragging, scraping noise, like something rough being pulled across the wood. Then came a loud snort, right outside the door. My heart was pounding. I stepped back from the window and grabbed my phone, ready to call someone if I had to. But who was I supposed to call? The ranger's number forwarded to his office, and he definitely wasn't on duty this late. The sheriff's department was half an hour away. I was on my own. The noises went on for another 10 minutes. Footsteps circling the house, strange scraping sounds, heavy breathing, as if something was sniffing along the walls. Then, finally, it stopped. I sat in the living room for another hour, barely breathing, listening for any sign it had come back. Nothing. Just the usual forest sounds: wind, an owl in the distance, branches creaking. I finally convinced myself it had been a bear. A big, curious, persistent bear, but still just a bear. I checked every door and window latch before going to bed, keeping a baseball bat beside me just in case. The next morning, I went outside looking for tracks. There were marks on the porch, but nothing conclusive. A few scratches on the wood that could have been claws. No clear footprints. The wood was too dry and hard. I told myself again it was probably just a bear, that I'd overreacted because I was alone. But that night, the footsteps came back. Same time, a little after 9. This time, I was ready. I kept most of the lights off so I could see better outside. Quietly, I crept to the window and looked out. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness and trees beyond the porch light. Then something moved at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet away. It was tall, taller than any person I've ever seen, and it just stood there, motionless beside a tree. I couldn't make out details, only a massive black shape, but I knew it was looking straight at the house. My mouth went dry. Every instinct I had screamed at me to back away, hide, disappear. I slowly stepped back, letting the curtain fall shut. And then, the footsteps started again. The heavy footsteps on the porch were louder than the night before. Then something struck the door, not violently but deliberately. 3 slow, heavy knocks. I didn't move. I barely breathed. 3 more knocks. Then silence. I don't know how long I stood there in the dark living room waiting. It felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. Finally, I heard the footsteps fade away, retreating into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed with the bat across my lap, every light in the cabin on, watching through the window until sunrise. When morning came, I went outside to check the porch again. The scratches were deeper now, more defined. And there, in a patch of soft dirt beside the steps, was a footprint. It was huge, maybe 18 inches long, maybe more. Human-shaped, with a clear outline of toes, but the proportions were all wrong. The impression was deep, as if whatever made it was impossibly heavy. I stared at that print for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't knock on doors. They don't stand guard outside houses. And they don't leave footprints shaped like enormous human feet. I knew what people would say if I told them. I knew how crazy it sounded. But standing there, staring at that footprint, I couldn't deny what was becoming more and more obvious. Something was visiting my house at night. Something huge, something intelligent, and something deliberately trying to make contact. I should have left right then, packed my things, called a realtor, and gotten the hell out. But I didn't. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be another explanation. I'd invested too much in this place to abandon it after just a few strange nights, so I stayed. And it kept coming back. On the 3rd night, I heard it earlier, just after sunset, when there was still a bit of light outside. I was cooking dinner when the footsteps started. This time they sounded more confident, less cautious. It walked straight up to the porch and stayed there. I turned off the stove and stood in the kitchen, listening as it moved around outside. It passed by each window in turn, and I swear I could hear it breathing long, deep, heavy breaths that fogged the glass. At one point, it stopped right outside the kitchen window, above the sink where I'd been standing only minutes earlier. I had drawn the curtain, but I could see the fabric tremble slightly, as if something was pressing against the glass from the other side. Then came the sound again, a slow, deliberate sniffing. It was smelling me, taking in my scent like it was memorizing it. I backed into the corner of the kitchen and slid down to the floor, curling up as small as I could. Every instinct screamed, "Don't make a sound, don't move, don't let it know exactly where you are." After what felt like forever, it moved away from the window, but it didn't leave. I could hear it pacing around the cabin, circling, over and over. It went on for nearly 2 hours. When it finally did go, I ran to the bedroom, grabbed my phone, and called the ranger. It went straight to voicemail. I tried to sound calm as I left a message saying I had a wildlife problem and asking him to call me back. He returned my call the next morning. I told him something large had been coming to my property every night, that I'd found a massive footprint that scared the hell out of me. I didn't tell him what I really thought it might be. I just said I was worried about bears. His reaction was strange. There was a long silence on the other end. When he finally spoke again, his tone had changed. He didn't sound friendly anymore. He sounded careful, like he was weighing every word. He asked exactly where I'd seen the print. I told him near the north porch, close to where my property borders the national forest. Another long pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Listen," he said quietly, "I'll be straight with you. That area's always been a little strange. The previous owners, the couple who moved to Arizona, mentioned some unusual wildlife activity before they left. They never told me the details, and I didn't press. But if something out there is bothering you, and it doesn't stop, you might want to think about whether staying is a good idea." I asked him what he meant. What kind of unusual activity? He didn't answer directly. He just said, "I've worked these woods for 15 years. I've seen a lot of things I can't explain, and I've learned that there are some things you just don't mess with. If something's taken an interest in your property," he continued, "and it won't leave you alone, there's nothing anyone can do. Not me, not the sheriff, not animal control. These things, they either sort themselves out or they don't." My stomach sank. "What are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying you have a choice," he replied. "You can stay, hope it loses interest, or you can get yourself out of there. Those are your only real options." I tried to get him to explain what he thought was happening, but he wouldn't. He just repeated that it was my decision, that he couldn't tell me what to do, only that he wanted me to be safe. When the call ended, I felt completely alone. The one person I thought could help had basically told me I was on my own. Still, I didn't leave. I convinced myself I could handle it. I started taking precautions, brought the firewood inside, stopped eating dinner on the porch, kept the curtains drawn after dark, double-checked every lock. For a few nights, there was nothing. No sounds, no movement. I started to believe maybe it had moved on, that its curiosity was satisfied. I was wrong. On the 7th night, things got worse. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard something I'd never heard before. A scream. At first, the sound was faint, almost like a low hum, but then it changed. It wasn't exactly a howl, and it wasn't a moan either. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. There was depth to it, a chesty resonance that seemed to come from something with a massive rib cage. The sound echoed from different spots around the house, first in front, then along the side, then behind. It was circling again, but this time it wanted me to know it was there. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child, trying to block out the noise. My whole body was trembling. The sound went on for at least an hour, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never gone. When it finally stopped, I heard footsteps on the porch again. Then came a new sound. Scraping. Long, deliberate scratches along the door, as if something were dragging a sharp object across the wood. I stood up and moved into the living room, staying away from the windows. The scratching continued, then shifted to the walls. I could hear it clearly through the logs of the cabin. A steady, rhythmic scraping that seemed to go on forever. And then, suddenly, a loud bang against the wall. The entire cabin shook. A picture fell off the wall and shattered on the floor. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but then I stopped. What would I even say? What could they do? By the time anyone got there, it would be gone. And I'd sound insane trying to explain it. The pounding stopped after that last hit, but I could still hear it breathing outside the wall. Right there, so close, I could have reached out if not for a few inches of wood between us. I froze, listening to the slow, heavy breaths. And then a horrifying thought crept in. It knew exactly where I was standing. It could feel me through the wall. After a few minutes, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps faded into the forest. I was alone again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with the lights on, jumping at every sound until sunrise. The next morning, I checked the damage. The scratches on the door were deeper now, gouged into the wood in long parallel lines that looked like claw marks, but spaced far too wide apart. The wall where it had struck bore a small dent. Whatever hit, it had done so with tremendous force. I couldn't stay in the house that day. I drove into town and spent hours just being around people at the library, at a cafe, anywhere that felt normal and noisy. I even thought about getting a hotel room, but something stubborn in me refused. This was my home, my property. I wasn't going to be chased out. That resolve didn't last. Over the next 2 weeks, it came back every single night, each time more aggressive than before. It started trying the door handles. I could hear them rattle, turning slowly back and forth, as if it were testing whether they'd open, but they never did. I'd installed deadbolts on both doors when I first moved in. Still, the sound of those handles turning, knowing something was on the other side trying to come in, was pure psychological torture. It started looking through the windows too. Even though I kept the curtains drawn tight, I could see the fabric shift when something pressed against the glass. Sometimes I'd catch a shadow moving past, impossibly tall. The calls it made grew more frequent. Sometimes they almost sounded conversational, like it was trying to communicate. Other times they turned into snarls and deep, guttural growls that made my skin crawl. One night, I heard it on the roof, heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing above my bedroom. I lay there for over an hour, certain it would come crashing through the ceiling at any moment. Another night, it wasn't alone. I heard multiple sets of footsteps, different rhythms, different weights, moving together around the house. They were making noises to each other, grunts, low rumbles, panting sounds that seemed coordinated. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom after that. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room, my back to the wall, where I could see both the front door and the hallway. I left the lights on all night. I was losing weight, barely eating, my hands constantly shaking. Every morning I told myself I'd leave, and every afternoon, when the sun was shining and the forest looked peaceful again, I'd convince myself to stay. How could I abandon everything I'd worked for, all that effort, all those dreams over some animal? How could I let fear win? But it wasn't just an animal. Deep down, I knew that. Around the 15th night, something changed in its behavior. Up until then, it had been persistent but almost methodical, testing boundaries, observing. That night, it started to withdraw. I woke the next morning after barely 2 hours of sleep and stepped outside to breathe the cold air, just needing sunlight and something normal. That's when I saw them. Lined up across the porch were 5 stones, not random ones each, the same size, roughly like a grapefruit, placed with careful precision, evenly spaced from the steps to the door. My blood ran cold. Animals don't line up rocks in perfect rows. Animals don't arrange things with symmetry and intent. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand. Was it a warning, a message, a territorial mark, or was it trying to communicate something entirely different? I left the stones where they were and went back inside. I didn't know what else to do. Part of me was afraid that moving them would somehow provoke it, that it would see it as defiance. That night, it came back earlier than usual. The sun had barely set when I heard the footsteps, but this time there was something different, a sense of purpose, a directness. It walked straight to the porch. Then I heard it moving the stones, the grinding sound of rocks scraping against wood as it rearranged them. I crept toward the window and peered through the smallest gap in the curtain. In the dim light, I could see the stones being moved one by one, but I couldn't see what was moving them. Whatever it was stayed hidden in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the porch light. But then, I saw them, massive, dark hands, almost human in shape, stretching out to reposition each stone. It was forming a circle, one stone in the center. When it finished, it stepped back into the trees, and the forest went still. I didn't hear another sound that night, but the message was unmistakable. It knew I'd seen what it left before, and now it was showing me something new. It could alter things, arrange them, create. It was demonstrating intelligence. By morning, the stones were still there, perfectly arranged in that new formation. I finally worked up the nerve to go outside and take a closer look. They weren't ordinary rocks. They were smooth river stones, the kind you'd only find miles away from here. The nearest stream was at least 2 miles off. It had chosen them on purpose, carried them here. I kicked them off the porch, sending them tumbling into the dirt below. I don't know why I did it. Defiance, maybe, or fear. Maybe I just needed to do something, anything, to feel like I still had control. That was a mistake. That night was the worst yet. It began with the calls again, but this time they were different. Louder, angrier. The sounds came from all around, multiple directions at once. And that's when it hit me. There wasn't just one of them. There were at least 3, maybe more. They had surrounded the house completely. I could hear them calling to one another, coordinating. The noises weren't random howls anymore. There was a pattern, a rhythm, almost like language, like they were talking. Then they started throwing things. The first impact made me scream. Something heavy slammed against the cabin wall hard enough to rattle the entire structure. Then another hit, and another. They were throwing stones, big ones, pelting the house from every side. I crawled into the bathroom, the only room without windows, and curled up in the tub, hands clamped over my ears. The barrage felt endless, though it probably lasted 20 minutes. Each crash made the walls and roof shudder. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I sat there shaking, waiting for whatever would come next. The scratching came soon after, but this time it wasn't on the walls. It was on the roof, right above the bathroom. Slow, deliberate drags, as if something was scraping a sharp object along the shingles and it knew exactly where I was hiding. I held my breath as it paced back and forth overhead, covering the entire roof. At one point, it stopped directly above me. Then I heard that breathing again. Deep, powerful breaths, as if it were trying to smell through the roof itself. And then came the sound that made my heart stop. A voice. It was the same rough, distorted tone I'd heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. But this time, it wasn't just noise. It was mimicking. It repeated my own scream, the one I'd let out when the first rock hit. Not perfectly, but close enough that I recognized it instantly. Then came other sounds, my footsteps across the floorboards, the creak of the cabin, even something that might have been my coffee maker. It had been listening, learning, replaying the sounds of my life back to me. I don't know how long I stayed in that bathtub. Eventually, the noises above me stopped. I heard multiple sets of footsteps retreating into the woods, and still I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. When dawn finally came, I crawled out and surveyed the damage. There were dozens of impact marks across the cabin walls. Some of the rocks still lay scattered on the ground, massive stones, 50 or 60 pounds each. Whatever had thrown them had the strength to dent thick wooden beams, and on the porch it had arranged them again. The same 5 smooth river stones I'd kicked away, now lined up in a new formation. But this time, the row pointed away from the house, toward the forest. The message couldn't have been clearer. I wasn't welcome here. This was their territory. I needed to leave. But I didn't. Stubborn, exhausted, traumatized, I still refused to go. That morning, I called the sheriff's department. I told them someone was vandalizing my property, that I was being harassed, that I needed help. They said they'd send a deputy. He showed up 6 hours later, took one slow look around, and asked if I'd had any bear trouble. I showed him the dents, the size of the rocks, the gouges in the roof. I told him it had been happening for weeks every night. He was polite but distant. He said it was probably a bear, that they can get aggressive when scavenging for food. He suggested I call animal control and install motion lights. Then he left. I wanted to scream at him to tell him bears don't line up stones, don't mimic human voices, don't coordinate attacks from multiple angles, but I didn't, because I knew how that would sound. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought every motion light the hardware store had. I installed them all around the cabin, along the porch, under the eaves, in every direction facing the trees. I bought an air horn, pepper spray, and a high-powered floodlight. I was preparing for war. That night, as the sun began to set, I was more prepared than I had ever been. The lights were armed, the air horn loaded, the pepper spray ready. Every door and window was locked tight. I'd even pushed furniture against the doors to reinforce them. The motion lights started flashing around 8:30. First one, then another, then all of them, one after another, flaring to life as something moved through the trees. What froze my blood was what came next. Whatever was triggering the sensors was staying just at the edge of the light, deliberately hiding in the shadows between the beams. It was smart enough to understand what the lights were for, and it was avoiding them. Then came the footsteps, faint but deliberate, circling outside. Instead of approaching the porch as usual, it kept to the tree line, pacing, and then I heard something new, a sharp, rhythmic cracking sound, like wood being struck with a bat. It came from different sides of the house, one after another, a pattern, not chaos. They were communicating again, coordinated, surrounding me. I grabbed the air horn and moved toward the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it, but I had to fight back, make noise, show I wasn't helpless. I threw the door open, stepped onto the porch, and blasted the horn into the darkness. The knocking stopped instantly. Everything went silent. I stood there, the horn trembling in my hands, finger on the trigger, waiting. The floodlights threw harsh, warped shadows across the clearing, twisting everything into strange shapes. Then I saw movement in the trees. Not one figure, several. They stood just beyond the reach of the light, motionless, watching me. I counted at least 4, maybe 5, massive, dark, upright. The way they stood sent ice through my veins, too human, yet not human at all. For what felt like forever, none of us moved. I stood on the porch with the air horn in my hand. They stood at the forest's edge, watching. Then, the one in the center, the largest, took a single step forward into the light. For the first time, I saw it clearly. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, dark brown hair. The shoulders were impossibly wide, the arms hung long and heavy. But the face was the worst part. It was almost human, but everything about it was exaggerated, primitive, wrong. It stared at me with an expression I couldn't define. Not exactly hostile, not exactly curious. Something else, something that made me feel like prey. I raised the horn again, blew twice, and shouted for them to get back, to leave me alone. The big one tilted its head, as if studying my reaction. Then it opened its mouth and screamed. The sound was beyond anything I'd ever heard, a roar crossed with a human scream, deep and violent enough to make my chest ache. It went on for several seconds, shaking the air itself. When it finally stopped, my ears were ringing. Then the others joined in, all of them screaming together, a wall of sound that rattled the windows and made the floorboards tremble. It was pure, physical pain to hear it. I dropped the horn, ran inside, slammed the door, and threw the bolts. The screaming went on for another minute before cutting off all at once. The silence that followed was absolute. I collapsed against the door, crying not just from terror, but from the awful realization that I'd made it worse. I'd challenged them, and they'd answered. They didn't leave that night. For hours, I heard them moving around the cabin, tapping trees, making low calls, reminding me they were still there, that they could stay as long as they wanted. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard the boards creak outside the front door. Something heavy stepped onto the porch, slow, deliberate. It stopped right in front of the door, the one I was leaning against. I could hear it breathing on the other side, feel the weight of it through the wood. Then, 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. I froze, silent, tears streaming down my face. 3 more knocks. And then a voice. That same hoarse, broken voice I'd heard mimicking me before. But this time, it spoke real words. Human words. "I know you're in there." I nearly screamed, but bit down hard on my hand to keep quiet. The breathing continued for a while, steady, patient. Then the footsteps moved away, but not far. I could hear it lying down on the porch, the boards creaking under its weight. It stayed there all night, guarding the door, making sure I knew I was trapped inside. When it finally left, I heard the slow creak of it standing, then retreating into the trees. I waited another full hour before moving. When I finally looked out the window, the porch was empty, except for a new pattern of stones. 7 this time, perfectly arranged in a shape I didn't understand. That day, I could barely function. I was running on no sleep, nothing but adrenaline. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every sound made me flinch. I tried calling the ranger again, no answer. I left another message, my voice cracking, begging him to call me back. He never did. Not that day, not the next. The following night, I can't even remember if it was the 20th or 21st, they brought something new. I heard them coming, many footsteps, heavy, uneven, as if they were carrying something large. Peeking through the smallest gap in the curtain, I saw them emerge from the tree line. 4 of them were carrying what looked like a massive log, at least 20 feet long, several feet thick. They brought it into the clearing and dropped it to the ground with a crash that shook the earth. Then they stepped back and waited. I didn't understand. What were they doing? Why bring it here? Then the large one, the same one that had screamed at me, stepped forward. It grabbed one end of the log, lifted it above its head, and threw it. The log flew through the air and shattered when it hit the ground 15 meters away. It was a demonstration. They were showing me what they could do, how powerful they were, what would happen if they ever decided to turn that strength on me. The message couldn't have been clearer. You are weak. We are not. This is what we can do to you. Then they left, fading back into the woods, leaving the broken log as a warning. The days that followed barely felt real. I'd gone past fear, past reason. I wasn't living anymore, just existing, hour by hour, waiting for nightfall, dreading it so deeply that I could hardly breathe. The encounters kept coming, each one adding a new layer to the nightmare. One night, they took all my firewood, every last piece, and stacked it into a massive pile in the clearing. A monument, a message. And I finally understood I was no longer a resident here. I was the trespasser. Another night, they bent the metal railing on my porch, warped the steps so badly no human could have done it. Another night, I woke to see handprints pressed into the outside of my bedroom window. Palms and fingers splayed on the glass, as if testing whether it would break. They were getting bolder, meaner, more aggressive, and I broke. The breaking point came on the 28th night. I was lying on the couch, exhausted but unable to sleep, when I heard those familiar footsteps closing in. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of the porch. They came straight to the front door. Then, a knock, not the heavy pounding from before. A normal knock. 3 even taps, spaced like someone politely asking to be let in. I sat up slowly, heart hammering. Another knock. Same rhythm, same force. As if whatever was out there had learned how to knock like a person. And then, a voice. I won't try to reproduce it exactly because I still don't know if I trust what I heard. It was deep, rough, wrong, like something that had never spoken, trying to force human words through an unfamiliar throat. Distorted, almost unintelligible, but I understood. It said, "Let me in." I stopped breathing. The edges of my vision went dark. Another knock, then another. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed. The knocking went on patient, steady, and every few knocks that awful voice repeated those 3 words. Finally it stopped. Footsteps moved away from the door but not off the porch. I could hear it out there. Then the footsteps came to the window beside the door, the one I never kept fully covered because I liked the view of the woods by day. I made the mistake of looking. Through the narrow gap in the curtain, I saw a face. Only for a second, before I flinched back, but that second is burned into me. It was huge, covered in dark hair. The eyes reflected the porch light. The features were wrong, too heavy, too pronounced, somewhere between human and something else. But the eyes were intelligent. No mistaking that. It had been watching me, learning me, studying me, and now it wanted in. I grabbed my keys and wallet, just those, and ran for the truck. No clothes, no laptop, no charger, nothing. I just ran. When the engine turned over, I saw it step from the porch into the wash of my headlights. It stood at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, watching me leave. I drove all night without stopping. When I reached Portland, I took a room at the first hotel I found and sat there shaking until dawn. I never went back. A few days later, the ranger called. Someone must have told him I'd left. He asked if I was okay. I told him I'd taken his advice. There was a long pause, and then he said, "Good. That was the right choice." I asked him what he thought it was. After everything, I needed him to acknowledge it. He was silent for a while, then said, "Does it matter? You're safe now. That's what matters." But it does matter. It matters because I need to understand what happened to me. I need to know I'm not crazy, that what I experienced was real. I hired a property management company to handle the cabin. They sent someone out to secure the place and prep it for listing. He called me after his first visit, said the house looked ransacked like an animal had tried to break in. The doors were covered in gouges, the window frames marked with claw-like scrapes, the porch railing torn and twisted. He asked if I'd had bear problems. I said, "Yeah, bear problems." The cabin still hasn't sold. It's been listed for 4 months with no offers. The realtor says people are skittish because it's so remote, but I think there's more to it. I think anyone who visits feels what I felt watched: unwelcome. The property manager sent photos before the listing went live. The place looks bleak, abandoned. The porch railing is still warped. The door is slashed deep enough to cut through the paint and into the wood. There are impact marks all over the exterior walls. The windows are intact but filthy, and in some shots I swear you can see handprints on the glass that no one bothered to wipe away. But the worst photo is of the clearing. In the middle, plain as day, there's a stone circle, dozens of rocks laid out in a perfect ring, 15 feet across. The manager asked if I'd made a fire pit or some kind of art piece. I told him I had no idea what it was, that it must have been there when I left. That was a lie. It wasn't there when I drove away, which means they came back after I was gone and marked the place, claimed it. Every now and then, a realtor calls asking if I want to drop the price, saying it's been listed too long and people are starting to wonder what's wrong with it. I tell them to keep it on the market, someone will buy it. But I know the truth. That land is cursed now, or occupied, or whatever you want to call it. And part of me hopes it never sells, that it sits empty so no one else has to go through what I did. Sometimes I feel guilty. Guilty for not warning potential buyers. Guilty for not telling the realtor the real reason I left. Guilty for passing my nightmare on to someone else. But what am I supposed to say? That the property is stalked by things that aren't supposed to exist? That they'll watch your house every night until you start to unravel? That they're intelligent, dangerous, and relentless? No one would believe me. And even if they did, what could anyone do? I still have nightmares, though they've changed over time. At first, I dreamed I was back at the cabin, hearing the footsteps, seeing them by the trees. I'd wake in a panic, certain I was still there, that I hadn't really escaped. Now the dreams are different. Now, I'm in my Portland apartment, and I hear a knock at the door. In the dream, I know what's on the other side, but I can't stop myself from opening it. And when I do, it's standing there in the hallway, too big for the space, hunched under the ceiling. It looks at me with those knowing eyes and says in that terrible voice, "I found you." I wake from those dreams and check every lock, peer out every window, telling myself I'm safe here in the city, that they can't find me here, that there are too many people, too much noise, not enough forest to cling to. But sometimes, late at night, when the city goes quiet, I hear sounds that make my heart race, the thud from the unit above, footsteps in the hall, a scratch along the wall, and for a moment, I'm back at that cabin, certain they've come for me. My therapist, yes, I finally started seeing. One says I have PTSD. She says what I went through was prolonged trauma, that my reactions are normal, that with treatment and time, it will fade. She thinks isolation broke me, that the stress of living alone in the middle of nowhere manifested as paranoid delusions. I let her think that. It's easier than arguing, easier than trying to convince her that what I went through was real. But I know what happened to me. I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. And I know that somewhere in the forests of northern Washington, there are beings alive that science says shouldn't exist. The creatures had territory, they were intelligent, and they were capable of a kind of relentless psychological warfare against anyone who trespassed into their domain. The ranger never called me back after I left. I tried reaching him several times during those first few weeks, desperate for answers, for validation, for someone to tell me I hadn't imagined it all, but every call went to voicemail. Eventually, I stopped calling. A month after leaving, I drove back toward the area. Not to the cabin, I couldn't face that, but to the little town where I used to buy groceries. I thought maybe I could talk to him in person, or at least find out if anyone else had experienced anything similar. The woman at the grocery store still remembered me. She seemed surprised to see me and asked if I was moving back. When I told her no, that I was gone for good, something changed in her expression. She grew quieter, more careful with her words. I asked if she knew how to reach the ranger. She said he'd retired suddenly a few weeks earlier, just filed the paperwork and left. No explanation. Moved out of state, maybe Montana or Wyoming, she thought. Then she leaned closer and said something I'll never forget. She said, "I'm glad you left when you did. That place of yours, that land's been there longer than anyone remembers." She said the couple before me hadn't lasted a year. And the family before them? They left in the middle of the night just like I did, didn't even take everything with them. I asked why no one warned me before I bought the place. She just shook her head and said, "Would you have believed us? Everyone has to learn for themselves. Besides, we hoped maybe it would be different for you. Sometimes they leave people alone," she said. "Sometimes they don't. You were just unlucky." That conversation haunts me almost as much as the encounters themselves, because it meant everyone knew. The whole town knew that the land was claimed, that something lived in those woods and didn't want people there. And yet, they still let me buy it, hoping I'd be one of the lucky ones, hoping I'd be left in peace. But I wasn't. And now here I am, starting over at 34, living in a cramped apartment in a city I don't even like, trying to rebuild the life I already built once before. I still work from home, same job, same company. Thankfully, my boss never asked for the real reason I moved. I told him I wanted to be closer to family. He accepted that. My coworkers probably think I'm strange, maybe even more withdrawn than before. I avoid video calls whenever I can. When I can't, they comment on how tired I look, how much weight I've lost. I don't date. I don't go out much. I hardly leave my apartment except for groceries or the occasional walk when it's sunny and crowded enough to feel safe. I've become exactly what I never wanted to be: isolated, paranoid, afraid. But I'm alive, and that has to count for something. Sometimes I think about the people who lived there before me, the couple who moved to Arizona, the family who fled in the night. I wonder if they're like me now, living in cities, afraid of the dark, never free of that feeling of being watched. I wonder if they still have nightmares, if they lie awake at night, listening to every creak and distant sound, waiting for footsteps that never come. I wonder if they ever found peace, or if this is simply the life we all lead now, changed forever, afraid forever. There's a support group online, people who claim to have experienced unexplainable things. I've read through their forums a few times, but I've never posted. Their stories are all so different: brief encounters, fleeting sightings, none like mine. No one else describes weeks of contact. No one else describes being systematically terrorized in their own home. Once, I started to write it all down to tell my story. I made it halfway through before deleting it. Even there, surrounded by people who believe in the impossible, my story felt too extreme, too detailed, too long. I was afraid they'd think I was lying or insane. So I keep it to myself, just like the owners before me must have, just like anyone unlucky enough to encounter them probably does. Because who would believe us? Who would take our stories seriously? The only evidence I have is that cabins, scarred wood, bent metal, and deep gouges standing silent in the forest. And even that doesn't prove anything, except that something caused the damage. The insurance company called it vandalism. The adjuster came out, said it looked like bear damage mixed with weather wear. He couldn't explain the twisted railing or the perfect stone circles in the clearing, but he didn't try very hard. I got a partial payout, enough to cover a few months of the mortgage while the cabin sits unsold, but not enough to keep paying forever. So eventually I'll have to decide: drop the price until someone buys it, or let the bank take it. One way or another, I lost. Sometimes I still find myself browsing listings for remote cabins in other states, other forests, and I feel this sharp ache for what I once had: the peace, the silence, the connection to nature that I cherished so much. But then I remember the footsteps, the knocking, the voice whispering through the door, "Let me in." And I know I can never go back to that kind of life again. I can never trust the woods again, never feel safe in isolation. They took that from me. Whatever they are, they stripped away something fundamental, something human. They made me into someone else, someone afraid, someone who needs the safety of crowds and concrete. And maybe that was the point all along. Maybe they never wanted to hurt me. If they had, they'd had plenty of chances. Maybe they just wanted me gone. Maybe they wanted their territory back. Maybe they wanted to send a message that humans aren't welcome there. If that was their goal, they succeeded. I'm writing this because someone needs to know the truth, because I need someone to understand that what I went through was real, that I'm not insane, that I had a reason to walk away from everything I built. And I'm writing this as a warning. If you're thinking about buying property out in the middle of nowhere, especially in the Pacific Northwest, near national forest land, do your research. Talk to the locals. Ask about the previous owners. Ask if there have been reports of strange wildlife or unexplained activity. And if people hesitate, if they look uneasy, if they tell you things like, "That's old land," or "You might want to look somewhere else," listen to them. Take those warnings seriously. Don't make the same mistake I did thinking you'll be different, that you'll be lucky, that you'll be left alone. Because sometimes the forest doesn't want us there. Sometimes there are things living in those woods that have been there far longer than we have, and they remember. They remember when the land was theirs, and they don't like that we've claimed it. And if you're unlucky enough to trespass on their territory, they'll make sure you know it. They'll make sure you understand that you're not welcome. They'll do whatever it takes to drive you out, even if it takes 28 nights, even if it breaks you. Now I understand, and I'm alive because, in the end, I listened. I understood what they were telling me, and I ran. The ranger was right when he said there are things out there you shouldn't mess with. He was right that my only choices were to wait it out or walk away. I chose to walk away. And 6 months later, I still believe it was the right choice. The only choice. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there at night. If it still knocks, waiting for me to answer. If it peers through the windows looking for me. I dream about it. In those nightmares, I'm back at the cabin. I hear the knocking, and I know I shouldn't open the door, but in the dream, I always do. And when I pull the door open, it's standing there, towering over me, looking down with those intelligent eyes. And in that terrible voice, it says, "I've been waiting." Then I wake up in my apartment, reminding myself I'm safe, that I escaped. But I also remember that it knows me, that it spent a month studying everything about me. And sometimes, in the dark, when I can't sleep, I wonder if it still remembers. I've never told anyone the whole story until now. The people who know me think I just had a breakdown, that I couldn't handle the isolation. I let them think that. It's easier than telling the truth. Because the truth is, there's something living in those forests, something that shouldn't exist, something big enough and smart enough to systematically terrorize a person until they break. And the truth is, it worked. I'm writing this because someone needs to know what really happened. Someone needs to understand why I abandoned my dream, why I left everything I worked for behind. I'm not crazy. I didn't imagine it. For 28 nights, something stalked my home, and I will never, ever go back to find out what it wanted. The ranger was right. There are things you shouldn't disturb, and once something like that notices you, your only choice is to run. I ran, and I'm alive because of it. That's enough for me.